London, 1888. As darkness settled over the narrow streets of Whitechapel, fear began to spread through one of the poorest neighborhoods in England. People whispered about a killer who appeared without warning and vanished without leaving a trace. His victims were found in silence, their murders so shocking that they terrified an entire nation. Newspapers gave him a name the world would never forget: Jack the Ripper. More than a century later, despite countless investigations, thousands of books, and modern forensic analysis, no one has been able to prove who he really was. Was he a doctor? A butcher? A local resident who blended into the crowd? Or someone no one ever suspected? Tonight, we reopen one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries and follow every clue left behind. Whitechapel wasn't the London shown in postcards. It was a maze of narrow alleyways, overcrowded lodging houses, smoky factories, and dark streets where poverty shaped everyday life. By 1888, tens of thousands of people lived in extreme hardship. Families often shared a single room, and many struggled to find enough food for the next day. Crime, violence, and desperation were common realities. When the sun went down, the neighborhood changed. Gas lamps cast weak pools of light through thick fog, leaving long stretches of darkness between them. Footsteps echoed through empty streets, while late-night workers, laborers, and women searching for a night's income disappeared into the shadows. Among them were women whose lives were already marked by hardship. Many had lost stable work, many battled alcoholism, and many relied on casual labor or prostitution simply to survive. No one imagined that someone was watching them. Someone patient. Someone who understood these streets. Someone who knew exactly when no one else would be looking. Then, during the early hours of August 31, 1888, everything changed. A woman's body was discovered on Bucks Row. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols. The attack was brutal. Police immediately realized this was no ordinary murder. But no one could have predicted that it was only the beginning. Within weeks, another body would appear. Then another. And another. Each crime seemed more terrifying than the last. The newspapers exploded with sensational headlines. Rumors spread faster than facts. London wasn't just searching for a killer anymore. It was hunting a ghost. A man who could murder in the heart of one of the world's largest cities and disappear before anyone even knew he had been there. The hunt for Jack the Ripper had begun. By the middle of September 1888, fear had spread far beyond the streets of Whitechapel. What had begun as a single murder investigation was rapidly becoming a national crisis. Every morning, crowds gathered outside newspaper stands, desperate for the latest headlines. Stories about the mysterious killer filled the front pages, often mixing verified facts with rumor and speculation. Each edition seemed more shocking than the last. As the newspapers competed for readers, the unknown murderer transformed into something larger than life. A legend. A shadow. A name that would soon echo around the world. But behind the dramatic headlines was a very real city living in fear. Shopkeepers closed earlier than usual. Women refused to walk alone after sunset. Families locked their doors long before midnight. Even experienced police officers admitted they had never seen public anxiety rise so quickly. The streets themselves seemed different. The narrow alleys of Whitechapel were cloaked in smoke from factory chimneys. Gas lamps flickered weakly through the autumn fog, creating long stretches of darkness where anyone could disappear in seconds. Every passing stranger became a suspect. Every unexpected sound caused people to stop and look over their shoulders. Some residents formed neighborhood patrols, determined to protect their streets where they believed the police had failed. Volunteers walked through the night carrying lanterns, whistles, and clubs, hoping that their presence alone might discourage another attack. Meanwhile, detectives worked around the clock. Witnesses were questioned. Buildings were searched. Hundreds of tips poured into police stations. Most led nowhere. Some contradicted each other completely. Descriptions of the mysterious man varied so widely that investigators struggled to determine whether any witness had actually seen the killer. One claimed he was well dressed. Another described a rough laborer. Others insisted he wore a long dark coat and a soft felt hat. There was no agreement. No reliable face. No confirmed identity. Then something happened that changed the investigation forever. A letter arrived. Written in red ink, the anonymous writer mocked the police, claimed responsibility for the murders, and ended with a chilling signature. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Whether the letter was genuine or an elaborate hoax remains one of the greatest debates in the entire case. But one fact is undeniable. From that moment forward, the unknown killer no longer had just a reputation. He had a name. And with that name, the mystery became immortal. As London struggled to understand who, or what, it was hunting, the killer appeared to grow even more confident. The worst was still to come. As the investigation intensified, one question haunted both the police and the public. How many victims did Jack the Ripper actually claim? Over the years, dozens of murders have been linked to the infamous killer. Some investigators suggested there were as many as 11 victims. Others believed the number was even higher. But after decades of historical research, most experts agree on one group now known as the Canonical Five. These are the 5 murders most commonly attributed to Jack the Ripper because they share striking similarities in location, timing, and the nature of the attacks. Yet even today, historians continue to debate whether all 5 were committed by the same person. The first victim, Mary Ann Nichols. In the early hours of August 31, 1888, the body of Mary Ann Nichols was discovered on Bucks Row. She had suffered severe throat wounds and abdominal injuries. There were no eyewitnesses to the attack. No murder weapon was ever recovered. The killer had vanished before anyone realized what had happened. At first, police hoped it was an isolated crime. They were wrong. The second victim, Annie Chapman. Only 8 days later, another body was found. This time, it was Annie Chapman, discovered in the backyard of a house on Hanbury Street. The injuries were even more disturbing. The killer appeared to have remained at the scene for several minutes after the murder. That detail deeply troubled investigators. It suggested someone who was calm under pressure. Someone who understood exactly how much time they had before being interrupted. The double event. Then came the night that shocked Victorian London. September 30, 1888. Within roughly an hour, 2 women were murdered. The first was Elizabeth Stride, found in Dutfield's yard. Unlike the previous victims, she had only a fatal wound to her throat. Some detectives believed the killer had been interrupted before carrying out further mutilations. Others have questioned whether her murder was connected at all. The debate continues today. Less than an hour later, just under a mile away, another body was discovered. Catherine Eddowes. The injuries were horrifying. The precision of certain wounds led some investigators to speculate that the killer possessed anatomical knowledge. Others strongly disagreed, arguing that similar injuries could have been inflicted without formal medical training. Even today, there is no scientific consensus. What is certain is that the brutality of the murder intensified fear across London. The final canonical victim. Then on November 9, 1888, the violence reached its most terrifying point. Inside a tiny room at 13 Miller's Court, the body of Mary Jane Kelly was found. Unlike the earlier victims, she had been killed indoors. With privacy and time, the killer remained at the scene far longer than in previous attacks. The crime scene was so disturbing that experienced officers struggled to describe it. Many official photographs from the investigation remain among the most haunting images in criminal history. The pattern: 5 women, 5 brutal murders, one small area of East London, just over 10 weeks. Yet despite the similarities, investigators have never been able to prove with certainty that a single individual committed all 5 crimes. Some historians believe the evidence points to one serial killer. Others argue that at least one, or even several, of these murders may have been the work of different offenders. That uncertainty is one reason the Jack the Ripper case remains unsolved. The mystery is built not only on what investigators discovered, but also on what they could never prove. And while London searched desperately for answers, the police faced another problem. They had almost no forensic science, no fingerprints, no DNA, no surveillance cameras, only witnesses whose stories rarely matched. And that would make the hunt far more difficult than anyone imagined. By the autumn of 1888, the pressure on London's police had become overwhelming. Each new murder brought another wave of public outrage. Newspapers accused investigators of incompetence. Politicians demanded answers. And every day the killer remained free, fear spread deeper through Whitechapel. But there was one problem. The detectives were chasing a man they had never seen. In 1888, criminal investigations looked very different from today. There were no fingerprint databases, no DNA analysis, no CCTV cameras, no digital records. Even blood typing had not yet become part of criminal investigations. Everything depended on observation, interviews, and luck. Detectives walked the streets for hours, retracing the victim's final movements. They knocked on hundreds of doors. They questioned landlords, laborers, market workers, pub owners, and anyone who might have seen something unusual. Every rumor was investigated. Every possible witness was interviewed. But the closer they looked, the more confusing the case became. The Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police shared responsibility for different parts of the investigation. Although both forces cooperated, the division sometimes complicated communication. Information had to be exchanged across separate jurisdictions, adding another challenge to an already difficult investigation. Meanwhile, thousands of letters began arriving at police stations. Some claimed to reveal the killer's identity. Others confessed to the murders. Many were obvious hoaxes. Investigators were forced to spend valuable time separating genuine leads from cruel pranks. As public panic grew, Whitechapel became one of the most heavily patrolled neighborhoods in Britain. Uniformed officers walked the streets throughout the night. Plainclothes detectives blended into the crowds. Volunteers from local vigilance committees organized their own patrols, hopping to catch the murderer before he struck again. Yet despite the increased police presence, the killer always seemed one step ahead. Then came one of the investigation's most controversial moments. Near one of the crime scenes, officers discovered a piece of a victim's blood-stained apron. Not far away, a message had been written in chalk on a wall. Its wording has been debated ever since, and even its exact spelling is uncertain because it was erased before daylight. Senior officers feared that leaving the message visible could trigger violence against innocent people. so they ordered it to be wiped away. That decision has divided historians for more than a century. Some believe the message had nothing to do with the murders. Others argue it may have been one of the most important clues ever found. Because it was erased, no one can know for certain. As weeks turned into months, the investigation produced hundreds of suspects. Some were questioned and released. Others remained under suspicion for years. But none could be linked to the murders, with evidence strong enough to prove guilt. No eyewitness could confidently identify the killer. No physical evidence pointed to a single individual. Every promising lead eventually reached a dead end. Then, almost as suddenly as the murders had begun, they appeared to stop. The streets of Whitechapel slowly grew quieter. The headlines became less frequent. The patrols began to shrink. But the questions never disappeared. Had the killer died, left London, been imprisoned for another crime? Or had he simply blended back into ordinary life, walking past the very detectives who were searching for him? More than 130 years later, no one knows. And that uncertainty opened the door to something extraordinary. Without a proven suspect, almost anyone could become one. As the murders continued, fear was no longer spreading through the streets alone. It was arriving in envelopes. Every day, police stations and newspaper offices received new letters from people claiming to be the killer. Some were written in neat handwriting. Others were rushed, stained with ink, or filled with deliberate misspellings. Most investigators quickly dismissed them as hoaxes. But among the thousands of letters, a few would become some of the most famous documents in criminal history. And whether they were genuine or not, they changed the case forever. The Dear Boss letter. On September 27, 1888, a letter arrived at the Central News Agency in London. The writer mocked the police, claiming they would never catch him. He joked about cutting off his next victim's ears and laughed at the investigators chasing him. Then, at the very bottom of the page, the anonymous author signed a name the world had never seen before: Jack the Ripper. Until that moment, the killer had no public identity. The newspapers quickly published the letter, and the name spread across Britain almost overnight. Within days, it was being repeated in homes, pubs, and newspapers around the world. Whether the letter was written by the murderer or by someone seeking attention, one fact is undeniable. The legend of Jack the Ripper had been born. The Saucy Jackie postcard. Just days later, another message appeared. This one was shorter. Its writer referred to the recent murders and used the nickname Saucy Jackie. What made the postcard so controversial was its apparent reference to the double event, the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes on the same night. Supporters argue that the writer seemed to know details before they were widely reported. Skeptics counter that the timing is uncertain and that newspapers were already circulating rumors, making it possible for a hoaxer to sound convincing. To this day, historians remain divided. The From Hell letter. Then came the most disturbing message of all. In October 1888, George Lusk, chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, received a small package. Inside was a handwritten note. Along with it, a preserved piece of what appeared to be a human kidney. The note was signed simply, From Hell. Unlike the earlier letters, it never used the name Jack the Ripper. Its crude handwriting and rough language were noticeably different. The sender claimed that the other half of the kidney had been eaten. It was a horrifying statement. But was it true? Medical experts at the time could not reach a definitive conclusion. Some believed the organ could have come from one of the victims. Others argued there was no reliable scientific method in 1888 to prove such a connection. Modern historians still disagree, and the evidence has never been sufficient to settle the question. A flood of hoaxes. After these letters became public, thousands more followed. People from across Britain, and even beyond, claimed to be the killer. Some sought money. Others craved attention. A few appeared to enjoy spreading fear. Police spent countless hours sorting through anonymous messages that led nowhere. The genuine investigation became buried beneath an avalanche of false leads. In many ways, the letters became a second battlefield. The detectives were no longer chasing only a murderer. They were also chasing lies. The lasting impact. More than a century later, experts continue to debate which, if any, of the famous letters were authentic. Some researchers believe all of them were newspaper hoaxes designed to sell more copies. Others think one message, perhaps the From Hell letter, may have come from someone connected to the crimes. There is no consensus. But there is one undeniable truth. The letters transformed an unknown serial killer into a global legend. Without them, history might have remembered these crimes very differently. Instead, the name Jack the Ripper became one of the most recognizable names in the history of crime. And with every passing decade, another question grew even larger. If the letters could not identify the killer, who could? The answer would lead investigators toward an extraordinary list of suspects: doctors, artists, businessmen, and even members of high society. Each had supporters. Each had critics. And none could be proven beyond reasonable doubt for more than 130 years. One question has refused to disappear. Who was Jack the Ripper? Over time, more than 100 names have been connected to the case. Some were investigated by Victorian detectives. Others were proposed decades later by historians, journalists, and amateur researchers. Each theory promised to solve the mystery. None has been proven. To understand why this case remains unsolved, we need to examine the leading suspects, not as certainty, but as possibilities weighed against the available evidence. Suspect 1, Montague John Druitt. One of the earliest names to emerge was Montague John Druitt. He was a barrister and schoolteacher from a respectable background. Weeks after the final canonical murder, his body was discovered in the River Thames. He had apparently taken his own life. Years later, senior police official Sir Melville Macnaghten suggested Druitt was a strong suspect, partly because of information reportedly received from his family. But there was a problem. No physical evidence ever linked Druitt to any of the murders. No eyewitness identified him. And much of the information came years after the crimes had ended. Today, historians remain divided over whether he was ever a serious suspect or simply became one through later speculation. Suspect 2, Aaron Kosminski. Another frequently discussed suspect was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-born barber who lived in Whitechapel. Police records indicate he suffered from severe mental illness and was eventually admitted to an asylum. Several senior investigators privately considered him a possible suspect. Some later accounts claimed a witness had identified him, but refused to testify. However, no surviving official record conclusively confirms such an identification. In recent years, claims of DNA evidence connected to a shawl have generated headlines. But those findings have been widely criticized by many geneticists and historians, who argue the evidence is incomplete and the item's chain of custody is uncertain. As a result, the DNA claim has not been accepted as conclusive proof. Suspect 3, Michael Ostrog. Then there was Michael Ostrog, a professional conman with a long criminal history. For years, some police officials believed he might have been involved. But later research uncovered evidence suggesting he may not even have been in London during the murders. Today, most historians consider him an unlikely candidate. Suspect 4, George Chapman. Another name often appears in documentaries. George Chapman, born Severin Klosowski. He later became a convicted murderer after poisoning several of his wives. Because of his violent history, some investigators wondered whether he had previously been Jack the Ripper. Yet the methods were dramatically different. The Ripper attacked with a knife. Chapman killed with poison. Most modern experts see these as very different patterns of behavior, making the connection uncertain. The Royal Conspiracy. Perhaps the most famous theory of all claimed that members of the British royal family were somehow involved. According to this story, the murders were part of a secret conspiracy designed to hide an embarrassing scandal. The theory gained enormous popularity through books and films. It made for compelling drama. But when historians carefully examined the evidence, the story began to fall apart. There are no reliable contemporary records proving the conspiracy. Most researchers now regard it as a fascinating legend, rather than a conclusion supported by historical evidence. Hundreds of other names: doctors, butchers, sailors, artists, lawyers, even police officers. Over the decades, nearly every imaginable profession has been suggested. Some suspects appeared convincing at first. Others were based on little more than coincidence. Every new theory seemed to answer one question, while creating several new ones. Why no suspect can be proven? Despite generations of investigation, one problem remains. The evidence from 1888 is simply incomplete. Many original police files have been lost. Witness statements often contradicted one another. Crime scenes were contaminated by the standards of modern forensic science. And countless rumors became accepted as fact through repetition. The result is a mystery where every suspect has weaknesses. Every theory has gaps. And every conclusion is challenged by another piece of missing evidence. Perhaps the greatest mystery isn't who Jack the Ripper was. It's whether enough evidence ever existed to identify him at all. But modern science has changed the way cold cases are investigated. Could today's forensic technology succeed where Victorian detectives failed? Or has the truth been lost forever? More than a century has passed since the streets of Whitechapel fell silent. The gas lamps are gone. The narrow alleys have changed. Many of the original buildings no longer exist. But one question has never disappeared. Could modern forensic science finally reveal the identity of Jack the Ripper? It is a fascinating idea. If today's investigators had been standing over those crime scenes in 1888, the outcome might have been very different. The evidence that never existed. Modern homicide investigations rely on evidence Victorian detectives could only dream of. DNA, fingerprints, blood pattern analysis, digital photography, high-resolution crime scene mapping, microscopic trace evidence. In 1888, none of these tools were available. Officers often walked directly through crime scenes. Curious onlookers gathered nearby. Potential evidence was unknowingly disturbed or destroyed before investigators could document it. By today's standards, many of the scenes would be considered contaminated. The lost records. Time created another problem. Not every police file survived. Some records disappeared. Others were destroyed. Important witness statements were never preserved. Even details recorded by different officers sometimes conflicted with one another. Modern investigators cannot examine evidence that no longer exists. In many cases, they must rely on copies, newspaper reports, official summaries, and personal memoirs, sources that do not always agree. The DNA debate. In recent years, headlines around the world claimed that DNA had finally identified Jack the Ripper. The story centered on a shawl said to have been recovered from one of the crime scenes. Researchers reported that genetic material found on the fabric appeared to match descendants of one historical suspect. For many people, the mystery seemed solved. But within the scientific community, the reaction was far more cautious. Several experts questioned whether the shawl could be reliably connected to the crime at all. Others pointed out that the item's documented history contained significant gaps. Without an unbroken chain of custody, it is impossible to know how many people may have handled or contaminated it over more than a century. The type of DNA analyzed also became a point of criticism. Some geneticists argued that the results could not uniquely identify a single individual and should not be treated as definitive proof. As a result, the findings remain highly disputed. To this day, no DNA study has been broadly accepted as conclusively identifying Jack the Ripper. Criminal profiling. Modern profilers have also studied the murders. Many believe the killer was probably familiar with Whitechapel. He appeared comfortable moving through its maze of streets, often escaping before police arrived. Some experts suggest he chose victims who were vulnerable and alone, reducing the risk of resistance or witnesses. Others caution that psychological profiling can generate useful hypotheses, but it cannot identify a specific person without supporting evidence. A profile may describe the kind of offender investigators are looking for. It cannot reveal his name. Digital reconstruction. Today's technology allows researchers to recreate Victorian Whitechapel in remarkable detail. Using historical maps, architectural records, and surviving photographs, investigators can model the streets almost exactly as they appeared in 1888. These reconstructions help estimate walking times, visibility, escape routes, and the locations of witnesses. They offer valuable insights into how the crimes may have unfolded. But they still cannot answer the central question: who committed them? A mystery that defies science. Modern science has solved countless cold cases. DNA has identified unknown victims. Fingerprints have exposed long-forgotten criminals. Advanced forensic techniques have corrected wrongful convictions. Yet the Jack the Ripper investigation remains different. Not because science has failed, but because the evidence itself is incomplete. Technology can only analyze what still exists. And in this case, much of the most important evidence vanished long ago. After more than 130 years, hundreds of suspects, thousands of theories, and millions of words written about the case, the world's most famous unidentified killer still has no confirmed identity. Perhaps the greatest mystery is no longer who Jack the Ripper was. Perhaps it is whether the truth can ever be known. And that brings us to the final chapter. Not about a suspect, not about a clue, but about the legacy of a mystery that has outlived everyone connected to it. In the end, the greatest mystery of Jack the Ripper may not be the murders themselves. It may be the silence that followed. After the death of Mary Jane Kelly in November 1888, the series of murders most commonly attributed to Jack the Ripper came to an abrupt end. No dramatic arrest was ever announced. No deathbed confession was ever verified. No piece of evidence emerged that could identify the killer beyond reasonable doubt. It was as if he had simply vanished. For more than a century, generations have searched for answers. Police detectives, historians, forensic scientists, journalists, authors, and countless ordinary people fascinated by a mystery that refuses to fade. Every generation has believed it might be the one to finally solve the case. Yet every new theory eventually encounters the same obstacle. The evidence. Some clues are incomplete. Others are disputed. Many have been lost forever. And in the absence of certainty, speculation fills the gaps. The story of Jack the Ripper has become more than a criminal investigation. It has become part of history itself. Books, films, television documentaries, museum exhibitions, walking tour through Whitechapel. The mystery has inspired an entire industry dedicated to understanding what happened during those terrifying weeks in 1888. But popularity is not proof. The more famous the case became, the more difficult it became to separate documented history from legend. What we do know is clear. 5 women are widely regarded by many historians as the canonical victims, though some details remain debated. Whitechapel was a community struggling with poverty, overcrowding, and hardship. Victorian detectives worked tirelessly, using the limited investigative methods available at the time. And despite their efforts, they never gathered enough reliable evidence to identify the killer with certainty. Everything beyond those established facts must be approached with caution. So, who was Jack the Ripper? A local resident who disappeared into ordinary life. A man whose name appears somewhere in forgotten records. Someone investigators questioned, but could never prove guilty. Or a suspect history has never considered. The honest answer is, we don't know. And perhaps we never will. Yet maybe that uncertainty is exactly why this mystery has endured. Most criminal investigations end with a verdict. This one ends with a question that has echoed through more than 130 years of history. Sometimes, the most haunting stories are not the ones that reveal every answer. They are the ones that leave us searching. If somewhere in the forgotten archives of history, one final piece of evidence still exists, it has yet to be found. Until that day, the identity of Jack the Ripper remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries the world has ever known. What do you think? Was Jack the Ripper someone already on the police's suspect list? Or has history been searching for the wrong person all along? Share your theory in the comments below. If you enjoy deeply researched historical mysteries where facts come before speculation, subscribe and join us as we reopen the world's most fascinating cold cases. Because sometimes, the past still has secrets waiting to be uncovered.